Okay, folks, hi. It's the 11th of November, 2021. This is Anthropology and the Human Condition, lecture number 8. It says 8A, but yeah, lecture number 8. We're going to be talking about, you've just been listening to, in fact, David Graeber, and we're talking about his book on debt. I'm going to get into that in the second half. First, I'm going to talk a bit about travel, I guess, because we've been reading Malcolm Crick's great book, essay on the ludic in reflexive anthropology. And in the next few weeks, we're talking about different styles of anthropology that have happened, right? So, you know, before the break, the exam break, and I hope you did okay. And thank you for the assignments. Great, I'm getting through them. Before the break, we were looking at anthropology as it was, and I guess the theme in the second half here is different ways of reinventing anthropology given what it went through. Okay, is given its background. Though we're still talking about that in a way because the ramifications aren't just to be forgotten. But yeah. So in the next few weeks, mostly today, talking about David Graeber because I'm slotting him in out of, you know, respect and loss of a friend. We fought a bit. We worked together. We fought a bit, and you know, in occupations or in of the university or in political situations, except for the Millbank where we stood for hours together talking. In the crowd, we kind of didn't get on, but as friends we did, and so he was a kind of complicated person, but yeah, it's a great loss that he died a year ago. So I want to talk about him. But Malcolm Crick is also passed away, but a longer time ago. He was my teacher, and you know, a very big influence on what I ended up doing for my PhD, even though I didn't do it with him. Let's say, sorry, I'm still fiddling around with the settings here. Crick was anthropologist at Deakin University for a long time, but before that he was at Oxford. And he is famous, did his work on so-called semantic anthropology, the anthropology of meaning, or the anthropology of knowledge, really. And I've retained that interest, as you probably guess. And he was taught by Edward Ardner, and I guess he was in a department where there was Wendy James, and there were all sorts of significant people there. But then he moved to Australia to help set up a new university back in the 1980s. I'm not exactly sure when he arrived. It must have been about 85 or 86 or so. Anyway, it was fairly new when it must have been 70, around 1980. Anyway, he was a fairly new university when I arrived, and I ended up teaching there for a while as well. And his thing was, well, he was a role model as a scholar. He read everything. And I mean, he wasn't a great lecturer. He would lecture with his eyes closed, as if he was reading text in his mind. And he had quite thick glasses and a little bit of an eccentric guy. You know, being taught in Australia by an Englishman was also eccentric. An example of English eccentricism, and he supported me until he passed away about 2004, I guess, by which time I was in England anyway. Yeah, but his work on tourism and anthropology of tourism that you've been reading is pretty influential and provocative. There's some kind of mischievous angle to it because he's provoking people with a kind of joke that anthropologists are just glorified tourists. And of course, anthropologists wouldn't like that because they take themselves very seriously. not that tourists don't, but, you know, there's a sense of play and relaxation in tourism, and anthropology is supposed to be work. And he was saying, no, pretty much the same. Basically, they travel from home, go to a place and look at all of the cultural things. And all right, they don't necessarily stay in 5-star hotels, but not all tourists do, right? But backpackers don't always stay in tents, but anthropologists tend to stay, or tended to stay, in tents. The tent is still a big thing. And you know, he got a bit of blowback for saying anthropologists are tourists. The tourist tout that, you know, the tourist guide that latches on to a tourist and says, go to this, go to that, it was not dissimilar to the informant that an anthropologist got caught by. We do this, we do. When an anthropologist arrives somewhere, they found someone also who would show them around, so to speak. This is our mythology, this is our kinship system, this is our rituals and whatnot, in the same way, but in slightly different ways. And tourists would be shown around by a guide. A similarity between tourists and anthropologists that we can acknowledge is that both tourists and anthropologists produce text. Anthropologists, books, of course, and tourists, postcards, but other texts as well, and nowadays blogs and online posts and letters home, of course, and all of that. So, you know, there's something in the jokey criticism that anthropologists are just glorified tourists, which is important, right? So let's talk about tourism. I'm going to start by talking about one of the texts of tourism, and tourism tends to produce lots of texts, whether it be travel literature or travel guides. And the probably most successful travel guide company is Lonely Planet. Good name for a band, good name for a travel company. Tony and Maureen Wheeler, and I'm picking on them partly because they're from Melbourne. They were, like many Australians at the time, who could afford to travel. It was expensive to get out of the country. The flight to just to leave Australia, whether it be to go to Asia or Europe, was more than $600. I remember, and that was considered a lot, or that is a lot still, but then it was a real lot. And so if you left the country, you tended to make the most of it and stay away for a while. And often young people on their, you know, year abroad kind of adventure after university or something like that would go, or 20-somethings, would go and of course get to Europe when it was where it was really expensive, and run out of money and have to work for a while, usually in England because of the language, but also across Europe, working as nannies or bar staff or whatever, and make enough money to then get back home eventually, often going via Asia because it was cheap, and by this bus, Magic Bus, or Midnight Express, or call all sorts of names. Midnight Express became a movie, but that was about getting to Istanbul. And the Magic Bus was obviously a play on well, I guess sort of Sgt. Pepper's meets the Who Live at Leeds album with that song, Magic Bus. Just gonna ride, and then the bus in the 60s, it's a common image, forever further. And they, anyway, published, first photocopied or roneoed, a Gestetner machine, copies of like tips and hints and places to stay for other travelers. And eventually they stapled all this together and produced a little booklet. The company starts with Across Asia on the Cheap in 1975, listing all the different little locations, and eventually becomes a huge publishing industry company. Here's their first book on India, Lonely Planet. You see the logo at the bottom. Not really well shown because of the course guide there, but it's a great logo. Lonely Planet and the planet. The idea is, yeah, you get lonely while you're traveling and you're on the planet, so everyone's your friend, so it brings the whole planet together. Oh, also looks like the London Tube Station logo, but anyway. Subsequently, they sold the company in 2009 for 100 million, which is a lot of money back then, and they kept some interest in it. It has an online presence now as well, about 30%, and they are still really make or break in the tourism business. I mean, in their guidebook, and they had some great people working for them. Michelle de Cresta, whose book here, she's a really great novelist actually, who I went to uni with, produced a book called Questions of Travel, because she used to work for them, and it's really typical of kind of the power of Lonely Planet. She's talking about Laura, who in the 1980s has got to Pondicherry or somewhere like that. Laura climbed into an auto rickshaw, three-wheeler, right? Outside the bus station in Pondicherry, and gave the driver the name of the guest house she had chosen. "Oh yes, madam, number 11, said the rickshaw driver. Thinking he had misunderstood, Laura repeated the name of the guest house. "Yes, madam," he said over his shoulder. "Number 11, Lonely Planet." Laura consulted the map in the traveller's Bible. The guest house was the 11th item in the key list of... Right, so people recognize Lonely Planet as this make or break thing for a business. In the travel guide for India, for Calcutta section, there was, well, there's recommendations of where to go, and a list of bookshops, the last of which says something like, and at the end of Sutter Street, there's a bookshop. Right? Well, that's the entry for Sutter Street, which is the backpacker street. And that bookshop, which is a kind of large street side lock-up bookshop, has emblazoned across his title, "Mentioned in Lonely Planet." I mean, and the mention is very tiny, but that makes or breaks a company. All right, we've been focusing on images in this course, photography, but not only, painted images will be subject as well. So let's look at the image on the first India survival kit. And the idea of a survival kit, a manual, a guidebook that helps you survive, is interesting, not unrelated to the kind of guidebook that we were looking at 2 weeks ago that the military has for Iraq, right? The Counter-Insurgency Handbook. Well, this is a traveler's handbook. Manuals like this are, you know, you can link them to economic issues and bigger issues of cultural clash and so on. But the survival kit, as it's now called the guidebook, but as it was then, had a lot of drawings inside rather than photographs, and some of them were a bit cliched and stereotyped, but this one on the front, particularly interesting, because you see there's a typical touristy scene. Actually, we need to look a bit more closely. I mean, there's a number of women there and a budget tourist, right, who's got a Lonely Planet t-shirt on, looks like. But he's been being served tea while listening to some women musicians. One's playing the dole drum, another one has a stringed musical instrument. It's not a sitar or sarod. And I don't know what the woman in the corner is doing. Yeah, can't see. She's something on a cushion. We should look more closely. I've only made the close-up of the backpacker, of course, because he's the center of attention. We can see he is wearing a Lonely Planet t-shirt. Yeah, hey, good product placement there. On the front of their book, they put their own company logo, very sensible. He's got a backpack, of course, because he's a backpacker, as they called them, and looks to me like that's a leopard skin covered sleeping bag. And his flag, the flag there is the South African flag. So we assume he's from South Africa. That's what backpackers do. He's wearing a money belt. We used to call them the IMF or the World Bank sporran. Like if you want to keep your money safe, hanging it out above your clothes seems a bit stupid. That's more like advertising. But yeah, and wearing blue jeans in India, a bit hot, a bit sweaty, but anyway, yeah. But let's look at the other people as well. The expressions on their faces. I mean, he's in some kind of, actually, we could read from the other sign. It's Lakshmi Lodge, right? So he's in a guest house, but it's done in a kind of fake traditional style, temple, rococo, or whatever, with lots of fabrics over carpets and upholstery in different styles. And these gopis, I guess, the women in saris, one serving him tea. Lakshmi Lodge, Lakshmi Lodge. Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth. So yeah, tourism will bring wealth. A big question whether tourism actually does bring wealth into the country with backpackers, because backpackers go pretty much cheap. And the real wealth that's made from backpackers traveling to India is by the companies that run the airlines. They make the big money, 600 quid just to leave Australia in those days. And you lived on a couple of dollars a day in India. Anyway, she's serving him tea. She doesn't look very happy about it, actually. I don't know how to read expressions on faces, but across culture, like, am I reading the same? But it looks to me like she's frowning. And the other woman there standing behind, looking on this scene, kind of is looking pretty negative as well. She's looking like a bit sad for this, looking with either complete boredom, and it must be boring working in a guest house, looking after this backpacker who's just going, give me 3 sugars, or 3, I don't know what he's asking for. She's, anyway, yeah, the relations between the honored guest and the hosts and all of these things could be discussed. And it's the kind of thing that Malcolm Crick in his text does get us to think about. What's the relationship between the host and guest, both in tourism and in anthropology? The anthropologist is a guest as well, often, not always, of course, and hosted and looked after. But this is the travel guide, right? So we can't take it too seriously. And eventually, of course, later, the cover of Lonely Planet would have lovely pictures of classic tourist scenes and so on. But the first one had this, and I think it's quite revealing. Other travel guides exist, of course, not just Lonely Planet. The most famous is Baedeker, which is old from the 19th century onwards. The red cover was distinctive. Red cover with a picture later on, much later on, but usually just a red cover, which was for elite travelers from England, for example, from the ruling class in England, who would go and tour the museums of France and Italy and see the Sistine Chapel and so on. And they have to have a guidebook to tell them what to see, right? And that's the same as anthropology in a sense. Anthropologists read other anthropologists to have an idea before they go of what they're looking for, right? So we say go and have a look for yourself, but when you go to have a look for yourself, you can first really see what you're prepared to see, what you've been, your mind's kind of pre-formatted. You expect to see certain things, like you go to Italy expecting to see magnificent Renaissance paintings and Leonardo and Florence and architecture and Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel and so on, or Greece, Athens and the ruins of the Parthenon and so on. I mean, they're the things that tourists come to look for, and they see them. Sure, if they stay longer or if they're better prepared, maybe they see an experience. Means they see some things that are unpredicted or unusual, but it's quite powerful how often the guidebooks kind of set out the whole experience of the traveller from the 5-star level right down to backpackers. There's another guidebook series called Insight Guides. Insight Guides are supposed to give you a special insight into the culture, and their one on Calcutta, where I worked, says everything you ever heard about Calcutta is true. Everything you ever heard about Calcutta. I mean, what have you all heard about Calcutta? I wonder. Can you give me some feedback on that? I mean, that was in the 80s, because it's when I was doing my PhD. But even now, maybe, what's the reputation of Calcutta as a city? What would you expect? What have you heard about the city? What would you expect to see when you went there? Just without thinking. Some responses? Right, so like, what do you think? Calcutta, it's a crowded city. It's you might know about some aspects of its politics. Anyone? Without looking it up, like I'm asking for you what your unthought through pre-impression of the city is. Like if you were suddenly given a ticket to Calcutta as a tourist, I know we can't go now, it's closed and COVID and so on, but say it was, what would you go and expect to see? In the same way that someone coming to Vietnam would expect beaches and really nice food and what else? Buddhism and I don't know what else. What do people expect? In the same way, Calcutta, there are things that people anticipate. Or India, temples. Anyone? You can type it or say it. I prefer you said it. Remembering that your cameras are supposed to be on. That would mean that you're supposed to be actually tuned in. All right. Okay, so dat, mai, ciao, boom, koi. I'm calling on you. So yeah, temples, poverty, Tagore, yes. There are various things. Poverty is a big one, crowds a big one, traffic. I'm not sure that everyone will think of hashish, but that's a factor for some. You know, there's impressions also travel in travel guides in a way. That travel guides prepare people for the expectation as well as telling them where to stay. They also give a little bit of cultural information and some hints of how to. And it used to be word of mouth, and then the travel guides came in, and everyone followed the Bible, Lonely Planet or whatever. And nowadays it's online, right? And it's more like word of mouth now again, because Traveloka or TripAdvisor, right? Pretty much anyone can say anything they like about a place now, and that all right, there's an algorithm which chooses which ones come up top, which come first. But it's more like how rumor and word of mouth used to work before the travel guys started to channel rumor. Lonely Planet started to become something that people would recite as if it was first-hand knowledge, you know, but they're just that someone read it in Lonely Planet before everybody else that they were talking to in the guest house did, but everybody was reading it. So it was almost like self-fulfilling. That's how rumor and backchat work, right? So yeah, budget tourism is a kind of traveler ideology, but five-star tourism has got its own versions, Boudica and so on, but it's really about the circulation of ideas. Although the distinction between a five-star tourist and a budget traveler, right? Traveler and tourist, they would say would be a different style of travel. But in the same way, there are differences between different anthropologists, right? So you can't really say like Malcolm Crick did, that travelers or tourists and anthropologists are the same, because there are many different kinds of anthropology, many different kinds of tourism. And yet, and the thing about backpackers is they tend to congregate in groups, right? And in the cheapest part of town, there's nearly always, in an Asian country anyway, a street in a city, like Ho Chi Minh City, right? Near the bus stop in District 1, there's an area, those little hems that have cheap guest houses where backpackers can stay. Well, not now, of course. I just went there last week to have a look around. A lot of the backpacker places, the hostels that used to have Westerners, foreign tourists come in and stay, have had no business for 2 years, and they've turned into something else. They've turned into cafes or design shops or import shops. Although import is also a difficult business to do right in COVID times. But a lot of them have had to find another way to survive, because there simply wasn't enough Vietnamese wanting to stay in them, despite Nui Viet, Đi Du Lịch, Vietnam. Domestic tourists won't want to stay in these cheap hovels that look just a little bit rough, right? This is, I think, from Dalat. I'm not sure. I can't remember now where I got these photos. But, you know, youth hostels are for backpackers are kind of smelly, rough. But it's not just that the tourists, the backpackers that come and stay in those hems, or in India in the cheap street, which is Sutta Street in Calcutta. It's not just Westerners only. A lot of Japanese and Koreans are going to India to, well, a lot of Westerners as well, to get away from the rat race, so to speak, and to then experiment with drugs or drink or freedom, just being, you know, out of the luxury of being unemployed and able to just wander from place to place, staying in very cheap joints and smoking joints. Actually, I'm pretty impressed with the Koreans and Japanese who get to know really down and dirty with the street people in Calcutta. It was really obvious that they were there just for the smoke. And yeah, whereas the Westerners were there to do good works, to do charity work and volunteering, and visit Mother Teresa when she was alive, or the Mother House now. you know, curious. It's anyway. There's a whole demographic to be done of studies from the 5-star tourists to the backpackers on the pancake trail, right? In those hostels and guest houses, there's comfort foods from home, so to speak, that you can buy anywhere from Byron Bay in Australia and the guest houses there, all up through Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. It's bun chewy, but you can buy banana pancakes in District 1 in some of those cafes, all through India, across Turkey, into Egypt and Morocco, right? The banana pancake or other kinds of comfort foods for that Lonely Planet tourist who needs to have a little bit of a refuge from home before going back out into the great big world. And of course, they're there to experience other experiences, or bizarrely, actually, to find themselves. That's a thing that I mean, why you would think that if you were somehow lost, you would go to India to try and find yourself in a country you don't know that's the size of Europe. But by the by, can't be too cynical about it. They at least send a few souvenirs home for the family and take some nice holiday snaps. And if they're lucky, they see the Taj Mahal and can appreciate the awesomeness of you know, cultural civilizations that aren't Europe or America. And yeah, and isn't that kind of what the point of travel is? To get out of yourself, not to find yourself, to experience something new, something different, to love the world, you know, and to also get some knowledge about how the rest of the world is. So anthropology and tourism as a provocation by Crick was controversial, but pretty successful. A lot of people did start talking about it and thinking about it, because it came at a certain time when ethnography was, it was 1985, quite long ago now, but was going through this so-called writing culture debate, wondering, anthropologists were asking themselves, what is it that anthropologists do? What is their practice, you know? I mean, it wasn't explicitly about the politics of anthropology, although it should have been, but it was reflexive, thinking about why anthropologists do what they do, why they write books about people, stare at people and write books about them, and the context in which they did it. And of course, as we were talking about 2 weeks ago, one of the contexts was the anti-war movement, or the anti-war movement around Vietnam, especially. But it's not just anti-war activity. It was support for the anti-colonial movements that had made it very difficult for anthropologists to simply arrive at a place and start doing anthropology, because people were asking them for a visa, or what are you doing here? Who's your knowledge serving, and so on. You know, so these ethical, critical questions came up in the context of the end of a certain kind of colonialism. I don't think colonialism ever really stopped. It just transferred to corporate industrial neo-colonialism, right? Companies becoming the colonizers instead of empires. But I mean, they're somehow related. It's really interesting that anthropology was having this difficult time going to do fieldwork, and then decided to turn inwards on itself and reflect about what it does. And is what it does just a kind of glorified tourism, or is it something more? Is it a political practice? What is the role of anthropology? And of course, anthropologists, but some tourists too. Tourists can go and be interested in revolutionary movements, but some anthropologists, most anthropologists probably have in their fieldwork notes or their archive a box of stuff from a political campaign or some involvement where they were on the side of the people they worked with. In the guy I'm going to talk about, David Graeber, later on, or next, it's the campaign in Rojava he was interested in. Other anthropologists looked at June Nash, for example, and Chiapas, the Zapatistas, myself and Bengali communists, so on and so forth. There's a sense in which ethnography, what anthropologists do, is also a kind of political practice. And I focused a lot 2 weeks ago on anthropologists on the wrong side, being employed by Rand Corporation or the CIA and so on, and embedded in the military, effectively, anthropologists writing texts for the Marines in Iraq. But at the same time, anthropologists have also been strong advocates for indigenous political campaigns. Rojava in what's Greater Syria or Greater Turkey, on the border between Turkey and Iraq and Syria, is an area where the Kurds live. And in Rojava, there's a revolutionary movement following the work of Öcalan and the KPP, Kurdish People's Party, and especially with women leading this revolutionary movement, they've made a very impressive. Well, I've not followed it as closely lately as I should, and the consequences of what happened when their backing by the US kind of became more difficult, and Erdogan, the Turkish leader, was pulling his muscle. I don't know, there's some geopolitics there with Putin as well, but Graeber was supportive of Rojava, and there was a version of anthropology that I suppose he championed. And that's why it's worth looking at David Graeber's work, which put anthropologists on the right side of political movements, advocacy, and for progressive movements. A way of doing anthropology that was recognizing that all anthropology, it's involved in politics already, politics of knowledge, politics of institution, politics of describing a people. So it might as well be honest about that and take up political causes via political practice. It's very interesting that he did that. I mean, that wasn't the main part of his work, though. You know, he's probably read more anthropology than me. David Graeber, anyway, let me talk about him. His big book is called Debt, right? It's a picture of the book. Debt, the first 5,000 years, that's called. So, you know, he took this topic because he was a part of a political campaigning style that belonged to that period where anthropology was forced to rethink itself, right? And moved away from, well, the question is maybe whether he really did move away from the tradition or the idea of the heroic Malinowski style field worker, but he turned that into something because of what had happened in the 60s and with people like when the US was at war and there were campus unrests, there was questioning of what anthropology was as a, or all knowledge, what all knowledge was in the service of the US military industrial complex. And people in anthropology, especially like teachers of David Graeber, and his co-author, sometime co-author, Marshall Salins, for example. I mean, Marshall Salins, I may have mentioned him or not before. He is an anthropologist who wrote Stone Age Economics, which we were made to read as undergrads. But he's really interesting later on. He also died just this year. But here he's said to be responsible. It may be a little bit of a myth, but said to be responsible for creating the teach-in around the anti-Vietnam War. Right? And a teach-in was like a sit-in, but instead of just sitting around to occupy, to protest, you had a teach-in. So instead of going to class, the classes went to the protest. And I've seen this used many other times. And it became a big part of Occupy, which David Graeber also wrote about. And that was a kind of protest movement in 2011, right? But, right, let's not go too fast. The 60s and 70s up through to maybe 2015, there was a real push, 2012 maybe, there was a real push to increase the size of universities, or the population that was going to university. They built these what's called the red brick universities in the UK. They're not like the old grey brick or brown stone buildings of you know, Oxford, the Dreaming Spires type. These were more like just cheap red brick in the suburbs or in the country towns or up north. And they were to get more of the working population, or the school age population then going towards work, to get them into higher education before they went into the workforce, to get a more well-trained workforce, basically, to make, I'm talking about Britain at present, to make the workforce more competitive in a high-tech industry environment, right? So you needed more training, more years of training before you went to work, and that wouldn't happen in workplace apprenticeships. It would happen in specialized departments and in the more vocational university than had previously been the case. You know, when anthropology first existed, it was a very small fraction of people that went to university, and a very, very small fraction of those, very elite, who did anthropology. And that's been transformed because of the need to have a smarter workforce. If more education does produce a smarter workforce, that's not to be assumed, because you know the bigger the education, the more people in the class, the less guarantee there is that it be quality, maybe. But there's also a drive to, or tendency to see education as vocational and a business, right? So none of the more esoteric educational topics really were viable. People joined university thinking they're going to be trained for employment. So and you can even go to university to do hairdressing and things like that now. So I mean, I'm not a conservative that poo-poos all that. I mean, cultural studies, come on. But they say, you know, Mickey Mouse courses, that's what they call culture studies, where you study cartoons. Like, that can be serious. That can be very serious, and it's a big economy. Anyway, by the by. The expansion of universities to get more than 50% of the British population into higher education was a big drive, right up until the Labour Party just recently in England went against that. And they said, no, some of them are saying they wouldn't advise even doing a degree now if you want a vocation, right? It's got that bad. Education elsewhere is still respected in some places, Vietnam, for example, and the number of young people going into education in a place like Taiwan is like something like 90% or more into higher education, I mean, but not in large working class communities and countries with a large workforce. You know, 50% is still high for the UK, right? and I don't think they're at that anymore. I think it's gone down. But at the same time, because they were having to expand the numbers of the student numbers are expanding, they should have therefore expanded the number of teachers, but they couldn't because it was economically not viable. They didn't have the teachers and so on. And the people who were running universities started to see them more and more as a business, right up until the 90s, when they started to introduce fees for university education and debts, right? That was the name of Graeber's book, and there's the cover of Graeber's book. So what was the cover of that one? Maybe that's a US print or review. Anyway, the global distribution of universities, education for export, was a part of the seeing university as a business. I mean, previously, universities thinking about overseas education for overseas, for non-nationals, Australia or England, for example, would pay people from Asia or the Pacific or so on to come to Australia, for example, to study as part of foreign aid, as a program to support development. But in the late 80s and early 90s, that mentality and commercialization changed. The university started to be seen more like a business, and they charged ever-increasing amounts to students who wanted to come from those so-called developing countries to the West for education, like many people were doing until 2 years ago from Vietnam, going to study in the UK or America and paying very high fees for the privilege of doing so, and getting back, I don't know necessarily what, the not as good an education as perhaps those institutions used to be able to provide. Not that I'm saying we should go back to the old days of only having the elite go to university, but yeah, there are many issues. And then the franchising of universities across the world. So as we see, not only are students going from Vietnam to Australia and Taiwan and America and England to study, but the universities from those places are coming to Vietnam. RMIT from Melbourne has a franchise office in District 7 here. Greenwich University from London has a franchise office here. Nagoya University from Japan has one in Hanoi. Nottingham Trent has one in China. Nottingham University has one in Ningbo in China. Monash University from Australia has one in Malaysia. Yale from America, is it Yale or New York? Yeah, Yale University is in Singapore. This is like the franchising of higher education. Also, it's a expansion of higher education, but it's also selling a product, and of course, mass-produced product. It becomes quality issues become important. Right? In these changed circumstances, anthropology's part is also interesting because, right, anthropologists have become more reflexive and looking internally, doing anthropology at home or thinking about what it is that anthropologists do and making their research about that. At the same time as there are new anthropology departments developing in all these universities across the franchises, or earlier, of course. There are anthropology departments at Delhi University and in Turkey and in Egypt, in Japan and India and Thailand and Mexico, at exactly the time when anthropology starts to look inward and say, oh, what we can't ethical issues, and we can't do that anymore. Everywhere over the rest of the world is setting up anthropology departments, not run by necessarily white people, but it's like a bit weird that at the very time that anthropology started to look at what it does and question the ethics of what it does, all over the world, anthropology departments were being set up, and those anthropologists were doing field work and traditional versions of anthropology, or taking on this reflexive philosophical thing from a different angle. I mean, in India, the idea that anthropologists would study their own society, right, which was a new idea for Western anthropologists, had always been the nature of Indian anthropology. Indian anthropologists were studying India, right? That just stands to reason. And in all those places, that was the case, except in the West, where there was a new and exciting, like they thought it was a revolutionary thing. But at the same time, there's also like a mass industry of teaching anthropology, and it becomes a kind of, I've said here, proletarianization of the work, but we'd have to go into a big debate about that in relation to Marx and the proletarianization, the becoming laborers of what was an elite practice. So is that a part of current anthropology? I don't know, maybe that's a claim too far, too provocative, a bit like saying anthropologists are tourists. But it does get onto the issue of why Graeber wrote this book on debt, because he was a normal field worker. He worked in Madagascar, right, in the island off the coast of Africa, in the Indian Ocean. But he never really, I think it's published now, but his fieldwork monograph didn't come out. Got bigger and bigger and bigger, and he didn't publish it. Whereas he did write this book, Debt, which is a kind of sit back and reflect, getting back to armchair anthropology in a certain way. I mean, it's wrong to simply characterize it like that. But some people have talked about this Debt book as being 5,000 years of anecdotes, because he goes back and looks back at places he can't go and have a look for himself, at Sumer and Mesopotamia and these ancient civilizations, and writes from there right up to the present. And he does it in a very anthropological, chatty, convivial style, and it's a super successful book, and I'm deeply jealous, of course, all that goes without saying. And he wrote it it hit at a time where there's another upsurge of a campaign thing that he'd always been involved with. I mean, I was involved in the mid-90s with this as well. The anti-globalization, it started out as the Anti-Criminal Justice Act and Reclaim the Streets, young people protesting against conservative government's backlash against the 60s, basically. And it became the anti-globalization movement, especially in Genoa and Stockholm, but then in the US. And the US side of it got more publicity. And David wrote a great book on it called Direct Action. I think I've got a picture of it somewhere. Yeah, right up the end. Direct Action. This is, look at the cover. It's really not an ethnography. So yeah, that was an ethnography he wrote, but it was a different style of doing anthropology. He went to the protests and he wrote notes at the protests. So he observed and he wrote about the process of doing anthropology. Whereas his Debt book is a more reflective, big issues book. And it's called Debt because it looks at global debt, the history of debt, but it really was because he had been involved in this anti-globalization. And the enemy of the anti-globalization movement is the advocates of globalization of a certain kind, the IMF, the World Bank, and their argument, the argument at the time was to get rid of third world debt or country debt. Right? Many countries were in debt, and after the 2008 crisis, it's interesting that a few countries did just abolish debt. What that meant was that those who owed money could then re-borrow and get into further debt, and so the people that are in the business of lending money could make their profit again. It wrote off the old stuff. But Graeber's argument is that all debt, historically, debt has always been more negotiated. That when you got to a crisis, you could renegotiate the terms of a debt and to sometimes forget them. And the IMF and the World Bank were having none of that. They were saying, this is what you have to do. You're in crisis, and this is what you have to do. You've got to allow globalization, open up your economy to international investment, and so on. And the anti-globalization movement would say, no, something else is possible. And the way in which the anti-globalization movement worked, and you see this from David's ethnography, direct action, more than his debt book, was that it used a lot of the strategies from the 60s protests. The 60s legacy was really strong. Concepts and methods of the sit-in and the teach-in and things like that. I mean, all of those other things that we talked about in the previous weeks, the controversy and anthropologists involved on the other side, and the end of easy anthropology, right? The crisis of representations was a factor, but so is the other side of the 60s, the happenings and the flipped classroom, questioning the authority of the teacher, the authorial voice of the anthropologists. The old was being challenged again in the 90s anti-globalization movement, and then 2001, September 2001 interrupted the anti-globalization movement a bit. It became an anti-war movement for a bit, but then infighting and the fact that despite millions protesting against the war, the West still went to war, weapons of mass destruction and all of that. But then it around 2010, there was a kind of revival of anti-globalization. So in the form of the movement of the squares. I mean, 80s and 90s, there were occasional outbursts I've already mentioned, Reclaim the Streets and the Criminal Justice Act. There was 94, the Zapatistas uprising, which was very fashionable across the world. That was in Chiapas in Mexico, but their slogan, "Another world is possible," became the slogan for the anti-globalization movement. There was Chavez in Bolivia and various other places. There were movements and other factors and so on. It wasn't really until 2010, though, when the so-called Arab Spring emerged through Tunisia. North African protests against the political regimes that have been in place for 20 and 30 years, right? Starting in Tunisia, but also spreading to Egypt, Tahrir Square especially, where there was the concept of the sit-in turned into something completely new. You occupied a square and stayed there. And this should have happened this could have happened in other places, but it happened in North Africa, Tunisia. Well, first of all, it started, curiously, thinking about Vietnam in the 60s. The whole thing in Tunisia started with a young man protesting against all this stuff, poured petrol on himself and lit himself alight in a public square. Where have you seen that before? The Buddhist in 1966 here in Saigon. It's uncanny that so many of the images of protest have that reference. But anyway, yes, the Arab Spring, or some call it the Arab Sting, because it ended up being, NATO against Libya and the execution of Gaddafi and then the destruction of Syria. It turned out well for Euro-America, but the movement of the squares happened in Africa. But inspired by that, the students protesting against the reformatting of higher education as business in London anyway protested, and they tried to occupy different squares outside Parliament building and so on, and they didn't manage to stay there, which was their defeat, really. They got kettled, surrounded by the police, and moved on. But then they were doing these teach-ins inside the what's called the kettle. The police surround the students and try and contain them, but eventually they boil over in violence, and then the police can move in. But on the back end of that 2010 student protests, and as I've said, I stood with David for hours outside Millbank as the cultural studies class was on the roof protesting that. Bless them. And University for Strategic Optimism was having its teach-ins and the student protests. This led later in 2011, after a series of, well, student protests, but they were betrayed by the Liberal Democratic Party. No surprise there. But it led to a thing called Occupy, which was another kind of sit-in, but this time at Wall Street, called for by Adbusters. You know, Occupy and Adbusters, they were not the only group to name the oligarchs of global capitalism as the enemy, but they wanted to stop Wall Street from working. And again, it was against global trade, World Bank, World Trade Organization, and so on. And David was a part of this and helped coin the term, we are the 99%, you know, the oligarchs rule the pyramid, and then there's the rest of us. And he was, again, writing about this in interesting ways. And his debt book was absolute winner on the book charts. And Occupy then spread to other cities, including to London outside St. Paul's Church, where there was a tent city university. And I like that fact that the tent comes back. Malinowski's tent, remember, comes back into the scene of Occupy. Occupy is a topic for anthropologists to write about. And the whole idea of the tent city university was that anyone could come and teach to the protest, and the protest, you're just sitting in, right? So you're going to be bored, and you're not like bored as people were in the culture industry, just watching the cinema like sheep and so on. You were an alternative to that. But the idea was that in the tent city university, anyone could come and talk on anything that they knew about, and it was a radical democratization of knowledge. Access to knowledge, anyway. That's not a new thing at all. The original universities in Bologna were set up by where people would be given lecturing jobs on the say-so of the students. If the students liked them, then they stayed. If they didn't, they were voted out. It wouldn't be the case now. Well, despite all the surveys that students have to fill in, they are just beauty competitions, fashion shows. But yeah, the tent university was a part of Occupy. The 99% slogan got turned around, and Occupy became a thing. Okay, which David was the spokesperson of, because he'd done the background work with actually that direct action book. You know. And direct action was a strategy. Direct action was basically you damage the apparatus of global capital without hurting people, right? So it had some ethical. There are other parts to it. Gift exchange. You would share experience with performances, tell stories. There were events within events. One of the things about the tent university. Of Wall Street Occupy was the development of things like fun things like okay, they were stuck in the square, surrounded by the police. The police had cut the electricity, and they were still trying to have these meetings, have this tent university. So they invented a thing called the human megaphone. So instead of having a microphone, like we see here, David smirking in a talk at some Occupy event, to get everyone who's at a protest to hear what's going on, the human megaphone was one person will speak in the center, and then the 50 or so people closest to that person will repeat what that person said loudly, all together in unison, and then that would be then heard by the people who are sitting a bit further away, the next 50 or so people deep, who then would repeat it for the people sitting, 100 meters away, who then could hear it and repeat it for the people sitting right at the edge. So this is interesting because everyone then participated in the meeting, but everyone said everything. It was still one person in the center, although they had an open mic and anyone could speak who wanted to. They had progressive speaker rules, like women would go to the front, or anyone who hadn't spoken before would be put in the front of the queue before others who spoke a lot. But there's still some hierarchy in that because you have to have some guts to go and speak. You have to be confident. You have to be, So there were still more males and more activists and more kind of veteran activists who spoke. But nonetheless, it was interesting. And then it had strategies for not taking votes to see if they approved, but something like that. If you approved of what a speaker said, you would wave your hand, do this thing called jazz hands. Thought that was a bit silly, but there's a sense in which it's a respected part of an alternative meeting process that would be more inclusive. And it's certainly the case that the human megaphone gets everyone to say everything, so people kind of own the meeting a bit more. Conviviality as a system, learning together, something, and thinking critically about this, and learning to unlearn the old hierarchical ways. Right, a central speaker with a microphone saying what you should. Not that way maybe sometimes works very well when that person is older or has read more or something. You do want to listen to them. We want to listen to David more than you want to listen to me, perhaps, and you can flip over to the link on the e-learning and listen to him talk about kinship and slavery and wages in a very interesting talk that he gave about his style is different, of course, and but it's good. But yeah, I want to say he's a part of how anthropology could be reinvented, and in the past 20 years has been in the possibility is there for reinventing, and some of the old approach stays, and some of the things that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, like visual anthropology, participatory, activist, urbanist, post-colonial and autonomous inquiry, especially workplace inquiry, are part of the challenge, and David wouldn't agree with all of those, and there are other people we can foreground, of course, and he's just one, but it's awfully sad that he died last year, just 59, born in the same year as me, so I'm a bit sensitive to that. He certainly is worth remembering as someone who really was focused on global inquiry, theoretical anthropological understanding, and the possibility of another kind of research with a ethical basis. But yeah, unfortunately, COVID has taken a whole generation before their time. I mean, he should have gone on another, I don't know, however many years, right? He does have another book out just now, a posthumous book, and it's about everything, history of the world, history of everything. Yeah, it's a challenge, another big, like a book like the Debt Book. I hope it's successful too. I'm looking forward to reading it. I haven't seen it yet. Yeah. It's inspiring work, and it's really sad that he's dead. I'm going to have to stop. Okay. We'll take a break and get back to talking about science.